Snow fell like quiet forgiveness that morning, soft as breath, endless as regret. Elias Ward sat by the frost-rimmed window, his wheelchair angled toward the wide, white world outside his cabin. The forest was hushed beneath winter's heavy hand. Every branch sagged under a memory of snow. In the silence, he could almost hear the distant echo of paws crunching through drifts, the ghost sound of loyalty that once walked beside him. The kettle hissed on the stove, a thin whistle cutting through the stillness. Elias reached for it with practiced care, his hands steady despite the cold. He poured the water over the same chipped mug he'd used since the accident, watching the steam curl upward, vanish. For a long while he didn't drink. He just stared through the window as if he could see time itself walking backward to that day when everything changed. The raid, the explosion, the scream of metal and dog and fire. Valor's name still lived in the hollow of his chest. He whispered it sometimes when the wind was cruel, and the sound would vanish into the wood smoke. It had been 2 years since the raid, 2 winters of silence. The department had called it a necessary sacrifice. He called it losing everything that made sense. He had been a man of motion once, running, commanding, laughing with his partner beside him. Now he measured life in small victories. A kettle poured without spilling, a log lifted to the hearth, a night endured without dreams. The town lay a mile away, beyond a ridge and a road that twisted like a scar. Elias avoided it when he could, but sometimes solitude became too sharp to bear. That morning, after the snow eased, he decided to go. He loaded his chair into the old truck, its paint long surrendered to rust, and drove down into town where people still remembered his name in pitying tones. Main Street was a ribbon of gray between snowbanks. The grocery's bell chimed softly as he entered, and the warmth hit him like a wave. Heads turned. Old Mrs. Avery behind the counter smiled a little too kindly. 2 young deputies whispered near the window. He caught the fragments. That's him. The officer who lost his K9. Poor guy. He forced a nod, gathered his things, coffee, tinned beans, dog biscuits he still bought out of habit, and rolled out before anyone could offer sympathy. The bell chimed again behind him, sounding like a sigh. At the sheriff's office, Amos Creed stood on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the snow fall. "Eli," he called, his tone cautious, as though addressing a wound. "Good to see you up and about." Elias stopped, the truck engine idling softly. "Had to restock." "Cabin's running low," Creed nodded, shifting. "Listen, I was meaning to check in. We're all proud of what you did, you know. You saved lives that day." "Not his," Elias replied, the words blunt but quiet. The sheriff exhaled, smoke mixing with breath. "You've done your part. Time to move on, maybe volunteer, get back among folks." Elias smiled without warmth. "Appreciate the advice." Then he drove away, the tires biting at the snow. By the time he reached the lake, the sun had sunk low, laying orange fire across the ice. He parked, wheeled himself to the shore. The lake mirrored the world above. Bare trees, a violet sky, and one solitary man whose reflection looked both younger and older than it should. He could almost see Valor beside him, that proud, alert stance, ears pricked to the horizon. The memory made his throat ache. "Still watching over me, boy?" he murmured. Only the wind replied, whispering through cattails brittle with frost. He stayed there until the cold began to bite through the blanket across his knees, then turned homeward. Days blurred. Snow, fire, silence. The pattern of his life repeated with ritual precision. Each motion an echo, each hour a ghost. But loneliness has a way of making a man restless. And so, when a flyer arrived from the local animal shelter asking for volunteers, he stared at it longer than he meant to. The idea of walking, or wheeling, into a place filled with wagging tails and expectant eyes was almost unbearable. Yet something in him stirred. Maybe guilt, maybe hunger for noise. The shelter was a squat wooden building near the highway, its windows fogged with the breath of animals and heaters. Inside, the air smelled of straw, soap, and damp fur. He almost turned back when he heard her voice. "Can I help you?" Clara Wynne stood near a row of kennels, a bucket in one hand, her hair tucked under a wool cap dusted with snow. Her eyes were the color of old glass, soft, worn by weather, and quietly observant. Elias hesitated. "The sign said you need help." She glanced at the chair but didn't flinch, didn't look away. "We always need hands, or hearts. Either works." Something about the simplicity disarmed him. She handed him a set of gloves, showed him how to check the latches, fill the water pans. They spoke little. The barking around them was wild and joyful, a sound that both comforted and cut him. Over the next weeks he returned, sometimes bringing tools to fix what was broken. The locks that stuck, The gate that wouldn't close properly. Clara noticed how careful he was with every task. How he paused before approaching the anxious dogs, as if asking permission to exist near them. She never asked about his past. She didn't need to. Some stories are loud, even when unsaid. One evening, snow fell early, thick and steady. The shelter lights glowed amber against the white storm. Clara hummed softly while mopping, and Elias repaired a hinge near the back. The power flickered once, twice, then held. When he turned, he found himself staring at a small shepherd mix trembling in its cage. Its eyes were dark and wary, its body pressed against the corner. Elias lowered his voice, instinctive. "Easy there." He extended a hand, palm down, letting the scent of his skin travel first. The dog sniffed, then retreated. "His name's Lark," Clara said, coming up behind him. "Came in last week. Doesn't trust men much," Elias nodded. "Used to know one like him." She handed him a cup of cocoa, steam swirling between them. For a moment the world was just that small circle of light and warmth. The hum of heaters. The muted fall of snow outside. Her breath visible in the air. She smiled faintly. "It's good for them to see someone gentle." He didn't answer. But later, as he rolled to his truck, he realized her words had stayed, like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Winter deepened. The lake froze solid. At night, the sound of distant howls threaded through the trees. Sometimes he imagined it was valor calling, reminding him that loyalty could outlive the body. Then came the morning that cracked the silence. A delivery driver stopped by the shelter, dropping off supplies. "You folks got a knack for lost causes," the man joked, wiping his boots. "Heard about a mutt over in Silver Creek Shelter. Been raising hell. Won't eat unless someone says his name, Valor, or something like that. Weirdest thing I ever saw." The name cut through Elias like sudden heat. He looked up sharply, every nerve awake. "What did you say?" The man shrugged. "Valor. Dog acts like he knows English. Just thought it was funny." Clara turned toward Elias. The change in his expression, hope, disbelief, terror of hope, told her enough. "You think it could be," she began. He couldn't finish the thought. His voice trembled as he said, "No, couldn't be. He's gone." But the name echoed anyway, refusing to die. That evening the storm returned, sweeping across the valley in white waves. Elias sat by his fire, Valor's old collar turning slowly in his hands. The metal tag caught the light, scarred, faded, still legible. Outside, the wind keened through the trees like a dog searching for home. He closed his eyes and for the first time in years whispered not in mourning, but in a kind of prayer. If there was even a chance. The next morning, Clara's truck pulled up through the drifts. She leaned out the window, snow on her coat, determination in her eyes. "The road's clear enough. You coming?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the woods, at the long trail of his life that led nowhere, and then at her. The question in her gaze wasn't about the dog. It was about whether he still believed in the part of himself that once commanded loyalty, that once gave love and purpose without fear. Elias wheeled forward, loading himself into the truck, his movements deliberate but sure. The engine rumbled, the tires biting into the snow. As they drove toward the next town, the sky opened above them, gray and infinite. Elias watched the landscape blur past, fields, barns, fences half buried, and felt something stir beneath his ribs, something that might have been courage or longing or simply the memory of both. The road ahead curved through a valley veiled in mist. He could smell the cold metal of the storm, the pine resin sharp in the air, the faint trace of hope he hadn't dared touch in years. For the first time since the accident, his hands stopped trembling. "Clara," he said softly, almost to himself. "If it's really him," she kept her eyes on the road, "then maybe Winter's finally ready to give something back." The truck climbed the hill, snow swirling behind them like smoke, the world narrowing to the sound of tires, breath, and the fragile heartbeat of possibility. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun had begun to sink, washing the sky in gold and pale rose. The shelter lay somewhere beyond, waiting like an unopened letter at the end of a long journey. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the hum of the engine through the seat, the steady rhythm of Clara's breathing beside him, the ghost of a bark echoing faintly in the distance. He didn't dare believe yet, but belief was already believing him. And in that moment, as the road stretched into the falling dark, the story of a man and his lost dog began again, just where hope had been left buried under the snow. The road narrowed as they descended toward the valley, snow drifting in thin veils across the windshield. The wipers beat a steady rhythm, a heartbeat against the storm. Clara drove in silence, her hands tight on the wheel, her face pale in the winter light. Elias sat beside her, his eyes fixed ahead, though his thoughts were far away. Moving through years, through memory, through fire. Every jolt of the truck made the metal tag in his pocket clink softly, a reminder that hope, once buried, had teeth. The shelter appeared at last, a squat structure crouched at the edge of the woods, its roof sagging beneath the weight of snow. A single light burned above the entrance, dim and flickering. Clara parked close to the door. The air outside was sharp enough to cut skin. She helped Elias out, her hands firm beneath his elbow as he settled into his chair. The snow creaked beneath them, a whispering sound like paper turning. Inside, warmth hit them, thick, almost claustrophobic. The scent of disinfectant and wet fur filled the air. A young attendant, face flushed from effort, looked up from the counter. "You folks the ones from Coldridge?" he asked. Clara nodded. "We came about a dog," she said. He hesitated. "You mean the shepherd?" "Yeah, he's different. Won't let anyone close. Barely eats. Just stares at the door like he's waiting for someone." Elias's breath caught. "Where is he?" The attendant led them down a narrow hall, past kennels where dogs barked and whimpered, past the steady hum of heaters working against the cold. At the end of the corridor was a stall covered with a tarp. The man pulled it aside slowly, as though unveiling something sacred. The dog was there, larger than memory, yet thinner, older. His fur was matted, his muzzle streaked with gray. He lay curled in the corner, unmoving. Only his eyes lived, dark, wary, glinting faintly in the low light. Elias's hand trembled on the wheel of his chair. Valor. The name left his lips like prayer. For a moment, nothing. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Elias tried again, voice cracking. Valor, heel, a pause. A low, uncertain sound, half whine, half question. Then slowly, painfully, the shepherd rose. His paws slid on the concrete. His tail didn't wag. He just stared, head tilted, as if recognizing a scent from a forgotten dream. Elias wheeled closer, every nerve taut. "It's me, boy." His voice was a whisper now, raw, fragile. The dog stepped forward, one cautious pace, then another. The distance between them closed inch by inch until Valor's nose brushed the man's trembling hand. For a heartbeat, time fractured. Then the world rushed back in a blur of motion and sound. Valor lunged, not with ferocity but with desperate joy, pressing his weight into Elias's lap, whining, licking, shaking. Elias buried his face in the dog's fur, his hands clutching that familiar warmth as if to anchor himself to life again. Clara turned away, her eyes glistening, her hands clasped tight at her chest. Even the attendant froze, struck silent by the sight of devotion reborn. When Elias finally lifted his head, tears streaked his face. "You came back," he whispered. "You found your way back through all that snow." The dog whined again, pressing his muzzle into Elias's shoulder, as though to say, "I never stopped trying." The storm outside had deepened. The wind howled, rattling the windows. The attendant frowned. "Roads'll close soon. You'd better head back before night," Clara nodded. "Let's go." They loaded Valor carefully into the truck, wrapping him in a blanket. As they pulled away, the snow thickened into a wall of white. The headlights cut only a few feet ahead, carving a tunnel through the blizzard. The heater blew warm air that smelled faintly of wet dog and iron. Valor's head rested on Elias's knee, his breath deep and rhythmic. For a while, they drove without speaking. Then Clara said softly, "He remembers you." Elias nodded, unable to find words. He looked down at the dog, at the faint scars running along his flank. Each one told a story of survival, of the fight to live. "Maybe he never forgot," Elias murmured. "Maybe I was the one who did." The truck hit a patch of ice, skidding sideways. Clara wrestled with the wheel, tires screaming against the snow-packed road. They stopped inches from a fallen pine. The engine coughed, stalled. "Stay here," Clara said, opening her door. The wind caught her coat, whipping it around her. She stepped out to inspect the tree blocking the road. Elias tried the ignition again, but the engine only groaned. Valor lifted his head, ears pricking, eyes fixed on Clara's silhouette in the snow. Then came a low rumble, a sound beneath sound. The slope above them shifted, snow and branches sliding in a slow cascade. "Clara!" Elias shouted. She turned just as the avalanche broke loose, a wave of white crashing down the hill. He couldn't move fast enough. The weight of his chair, the narrow space, the frozen world, everything conspired against him. But Valor leapt, bounding into the storm, barking wildly, circling Clara. The dog's movements were frantic but precise, guiding her backward, away from the heaviest fall. The snow buried the road, but Clara was safe, breathless, eyes wide with shock. Valor returned to Elias, fur dusted in white, tail wagging weakly. She climbed back into the truck, shaking. "We're stuck," she said, voice trembling. Elias looked out into the swirling dark. "Maybe, but we're alive." They waited out the storm in silence, wrapped in blankets, the engine finally catching enough to provide warmth. Valor lay between them, his head resting on both their laps. Each breath he took seemed to thaw something long frozen. Hours passed. The snow eased into a soft fall, like feathers drifting from a torn pillow. When dawn came, pale and tender, the world was unrecognizable, a kingdom of white untouched by sorrow. They managed to clear a path and make it home by noon. The cabin stood under a crust of ice, smoke still curling from the chimney where the fire had burned low. Inside, Elias lit new logs, the flames leaping greedily, washing the room in gold. Valor circled once before lying down beside the hearth, stretching his limbs as though reclaiming an old place. The sound of his breathing filled the room, steady and sure. Clara hung their coats near the door and poured tea, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. "You should rest," she said. He smiled faintly. "I think I already am." Later, when the storm had fully passed, they stepped outside. The air was sharp, but the sun broke through, scattering diamonds across the snow. Elias wheeled closer to the edge of the woods, watching the wind sculpt drifts into graceful arcs. Valor trotted ahead, leaving prints that zigzagged toward the frozen lake. Clara joined him quietly. "You think he remembers this place?" "He remembers everything," Elias said. "Dogs always do." "It's people who forget." They watched as Valor paused by the lake's edge, nose lifted toward the horizon. His breath made small clouds that disappeared into light. For Elias, the sight was almost unbearable in its beauty. The dog, the snow, the silence. It was as if the years between loss and reunion had been nothing but a long breath held under water. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire again. The kettle whistled, and the warmth of the room pulsed softly around them. Valor's head rested on Elias's knee, his eyes half closed. Clara dozed in the chair opposite, her hand slipping to the floor where it brushed the dog's paw. Elias stared into the flames, watching them dance and curl. He felt no need to speak, no need to fill the silence. The house, once hollow, was alive again. When night deepened, he opened a small journal and began to write. The words came slowly, haltingly. "Some love never ends. It only waits for the world to quiet down enough to be heard again." He set the pen aside and looked toward the window. Outside, snow began to fall once more. Not heavy this time, but soft, forgiving. The world had turned to silver. He reached down to scratch behind Valor's ear. "You did good, partner," he said quietly. The dog thumped his tail once against the floor, a sound so simple and full it made Elias's throat tighten. Clara stirred and smiled sleepily. "He's home," Elias nodded. "We all are." For a long moment, they sat there, three lives woven together by loss, by endurance, by the small miracle of finding what was thought lost forever. When the fire dimmed to embers, Elias leaned back, eyes half closed. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking to the night itself. "If anyone's listening," he said, "don't lose faith when the world goes quiet. Sometimes silence isn't the end. It's just the world holding its breath before something good returns." The snow thickened again, gentle and unhurried. Inside, warmth glowed like memory, like promise. And if someone were to pass the cabin at that hour, they'd see a soft light in the window, hear the faint rhythm of a tale against the floorboards, and maybe feel, without knowing why, that the world still had a few small miracles left in it. Because in that house by the frozen lake, a man had found his purpose again. A dog had found his home. And winter itself, once cruel, had remembered mercy. And somewhere in that mercy was a whisper meant for all who listen. Never stop believing in the sound of what loves you calling your name.